Chapter 6. What the mark doesn't match. Quiet, unease, threading through a procedural debrief, the first real crack in Gary's charm. Script: I am Bryce of the Cinder Archive, and this is Chapter 6, What the Mark Doesn't Match. 5 strangers came down off a sky parrot's hull with a captured captain, a wounded man's parting threat about someone called the Collector, and a maker's mark that looked almost, but not quite, like the signature of the man who'd sent them up there in the first place. They brought all 3 of those things home to Aetherglen, along with the rest of the evidence Garrick Sterling had asked them to recover, and laid it all out for him to see. This is the chapter where they ask him the obvious question. Watch how long it takes him to answer it. Watch. More than that, what kind of answer he gives. Because the man has not once, in 2 encounters now, told this party an outright lie. He has simply never quite told them everything. There is a difference, and tonight it starts to show. Double. The debrief room at the Gearwright Hall is smaller than Geary's workshop and considerably less interesting to look at. Bare work table, a row of shuttered windows, the faint, ever-present smell of hot metal and alchemical solvent that seems to live permanently in the walls of every room this hall has ever built, regardless of how far that particular room sits from an actual forge. It's the smell of the place more than anything else that finally convinces all 5 of them they're really back. That the rigging, the wind, the frost-cracked rig dropping out of the dark, all of it happened somewhere else, to people who were briefly, temporarily, someone other than who they are standing here now, tired, sore in places none of them are admitting to, aloud, blinking under steady lamplight after 2 days of moonlit improvisation. I could sleep for a week, Wick announces, to no one in particular, easing himself down into one of the room's hard wooden chairs with the theatrical groan of a man who has, in fact, slept considerably less than that in worse chairs than this one. You could sleep anywhere, at any hour, regardless of circumstance, Brown says. That's not exhaustion. That's just you. It's a gift. It's a liability the day it gets you killed. Tamsin, leaning against the wall with the cracked housing still cradled against her chest, manages something that's almost a laugh. The first genuinely light sound any of them has made since the catwalk, and even Orsa, arms folded by the shuttered window, allows the corner of her mouth a brief, grudging twitch upward, resuming her customary watchfulness over a room she still doesn't entirely trust. A single hall clerk takes inventory of the recovered gear with the brisk, unbothered competence of a woman who has logged stranger things than a frost-cracked thruster rig before her morning tea. She notes the second, unsold housing first, still half-racked in its oilcloth. Then Voss's abandoned ledger, flagged for the hall's own legal interest given the names blotted out inside it. Then, last and most carefully, the cracked rig itself, the one with the scratched mark tucked along its inner seam. And the captain, the clerk says, pen poised. Status? Handed off to the watch house this morning, Bram says. Piracy charges, unregistered Magitech possession, the usual list. She didn't fight the paperwork. Generous of her. The clerk makes a final notation and steps back. He'll want to see you now. Foot-tall brass fellow on the table there. Don't mind the scale. He always looks a little wrong in miniature, even to people who've known him for years. She leaves them to it. For a moment, the room is just 5 tired people and a small, dormant shape on the work table, no taller than a forearm. Brass-plated and faintly dust-furred at the joints from disuse. And then it isn't dormant anymore. A lens at the front of its head-shaped housing flickers, catches, steadies into something like a face, and Garrick Sterling's features assemble themselves across it at a scale that doesn't quite work, his familiar grin a half-inch too wide for the frame meant to hold it. There they are, the proxy says, and Geary's voice run through some thin mechanical filter that makes it sound like he's speaking from the far end of a long brass pipe. Alive, mostly upright, and, I'm told, in possession of a Sky Pirate captain's entire engine room. I'm almost afraid to ask how that went. Almost, Wick says. I have excellent self-control. Go on. Tell me everything. And don't skip the part where it nearly killed someone. Because that part's always the best part. Nobody died, Senna says. I never said anyone had to. I said it's always the best part when it nearly happens and then doesn't, which is a considerably more pleasant story to be told secondhand. The small brass face manages, somehow, the exact shape of Gary's usual grin, undimmed by the strange scale of it. Bram. You look unharmed, which I'll choose to interpret as a personal favor to me, rather than simple competence. Don't flatter yourself, Bram says, without any real edge to it. Wouldn't dream of it. Tamsin. You're upright too, which given the company you keep this week I consider a genuine professional achievement on someone's part. A pause, brief and warm, nothing in it yet to suggest what's coming. Orsa, I trust the engine room was every bit as dreadful as you feared it would be. Worse, Orsa says. Thank you for asking. I do try to be thorough. He settles, or the proxy's posture settles for him, into something that approximates leaning forward across a table he isn't actually sitting at. Right. Properly now. Tell me everything. It's Senna who gives the report proper. Clean, economical, the kind of accounting the Ashen Vow trains into its paladins from the first year of service. Voss's reveal, the rigging fight, the cooling vent exploit, the captain's surrender, Voss's wounded escape. Geary's projected face does something complicated through most of it. Delight at the captain's capture, a wince at the description of the vent lance's fire arcs. Something that might be pride when Senna mentions, without elaborating, that she kept the fight non-lethal throughout. You froze his vents, he says, when she gets to that part, leaning the proxy's small brass frame forward like the rest of him might follow if the table allowed it. Genuinely froze them. Thermal shock on hot housing? That's not a textbook tactic. That's somebody actually understanding the physics of the thing they're fighting. Whose idea? Mine, Orsa says. From where she's leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, watching the small flickering face with the flat, unhurried attention of someone who has learned to be suspicious of charm, precisely because it works on her too easily otherwise. Tamsin spotted the vulnerability. I supplied the weather. Outstanding. Truly. I wish I'd been there to see his face when it seized. A short, delighted laugh, the kind that still, even now, makes it easy to forget how strange this whole arrangement is. 5 strangers and a foot-tall brass puppet, standing around discussing tactics like old friends. And the second housing? That's the one he never finished selling? Still wrapped, Bram confirms. Ledger's there too. Names blotted out inside it, recent ink, deliberate. Hall's holding both for now. A resale man, Geary says, turning the description over like he's tasting it for off notes. Doesn't build, just refines and delivers. That tracks, unfortunately. There's always a resale man, somewhere down the chain, happy to take the risk for a cut of the profit and none of the actual cleverness. He mentioned a collector, Bram says. Someone above him. Didn't name them. Just said the shipment was compromised and that they wouldn't enjoy hearing it. Charming trade, this. The proxy's small brass shoulders manage something like a shrug. There's always a collector too. Doesn't mean it's the same collector every time, or that it's anyone worth losing sleep over. Men like that buy in bulk and sell in pieces. It's not romantic. It's just inventory. It's the kind of answer that sounds complete right up until you've heard it twice, and Bram, for one, is already filing it away as exactly that. Not a lie, not even really a deflection, just a sentence built to end a line of questioning rather than open one. There's something else, Tamsin says, before anyone can decide whether to push on the collector. She nods at the housing on the table, the cracked one, the one she's been carrying with both hands like it might still bite her. On the inner seam. We found a mark. She holds it up to the proxy's lens herself, angling it so the scratched crown of teeth catches what little lamplight the room has to offer. The pause that follows is not a long pause by any ordinary measure, a heartbeat, maybe 2. But it happens in a man, in a proxy carrying a man's voice and a man's face at the wrong scale, who has not in either of their 2 prior meetings ever once needed even a heartbeat to find something to say. Garrick Sterling fills silences for a living. He fills them in workshops, in front of strangers, in front of hall masters who outrank him in title if nothing else. He does not, as a matter of established personal habit, simply stop talking. He stops talking. Geary, Senna says gently into the gap. Sorry, bad signal through the relay. Sometimes happens this far from the workshop proper. It's a lie about the cause, delivered with the easy fluency of a man covering for something, though notably, and Bram clocks this too, filing it beside the collector comment. It isn't quite a lie about the pause itself. Something did genuinely interrupt him. He's just chosen which half of the truth to offer an excuse for. Let me see that properly. The lens leans closer, magnifying, and for several long seconds nobody in the room says anything at all, watching a small brass face study a small scratched mark with an intensity that doesn't match the casual, unbothered registration he's given everything else laid out on this table tonight. Even the workshop oil smell that always seems to cling faintly to the proxy's housing seems to thicken in the quiet. Or maybe that's just Tamsin's imagination, reaching for something to notice that isn't the silence itself. Well, he says finally, and the charm is back, fully reassembled, though it sits a fraction too carefully now, like a coat put back on a few buttons askew. That's not a school I recognize. What does that mean? Wick asks. Exactly. It means exactly what it sounds like. Every proper craftsman's got a teaching lineage, the hall that trained them, the master whose habits they picked up without meaning to, the little tells that give away whose workshop made you before you ever check the signature. This, a flick of the lens toward the housing, doesn't read like anyone's training. Not gearwright. Not any of the 3 rival halls I'd recognize on sight. Whoever scratched that taught themselves or learned from someone who isn't on any roster I know. It is, Tamsin notices, turning the phrase over the way she'd turn over a suspicious weld, an answer to a question slightly different from the one anyone actually asked him. That's not what I asked, Brum says, flat, beating her to it by half a second. I asked if you recognized the mark. Not the school. The mark. Another pause. Shorter this time, but not nothing. It's a poor copy of mine, Geary says. Obviously. You don't need me standing here to tell you that, Bram. You've all got eyes. A short laugh, the kind that's supposed to land as self-deprecating, and lands instead as a man trying to get past the sentence as quickly as possible. 5 teeth instead of 6, scratched instead of struck. Whoever did it either doesn't know my actual mark well enough to copy it properly, or he doesn't finish that sentence. He lets it hang, exactly the way the spellcaster's he will hang 2 chapters from now, for reasons nobody in this room has any way of anticipating yet, and reaches instead for the easy exit every conversation with him eventually offers. Or it doesn't matter, because either way, it's one more thing for me to worry about, and absolutely nothing for the 5 of you to worry about. You did the job. You did it well. Leave the housing and the ledger with the hall. I'll have my own people go over both properly, and I mean that, properly. Not the someone glanced at once kind of properly. You should all go get some sleep. You've clearly earned. Geary, Senna tries again, if there's something about this that... There's a sky pirate captain in a watchhouse cell tonight because the 5 of you did exactly what I asked, the proxy says warmly, over her in the specific tone of a man closing a door with great affection and considerable speed. That's the whole of it. That's enough for one evening. Go home. Truly, go. I'll send word the moment there's anything worth sending word about. The lens dims before anyone can answer him properly, the small brass shoulders settling back into their dormant slump. And the room is just 5 tired people again, standing around a work table with a cracked housing and an unfinished question between them. Well, Wick says into the new quiet, that was a go-home if I've ever heard one. He's never once told us to go home before he was finished talking, Senna says slowly, like she's only just hearing herself say it. Not once. Not even when we were arguing with him in Chapter 2 about why this job pays so well. He also never once paused like that, Brom says. Not on anything. Not on the captain, not on Voss, not on the collector line. Just the mark. He looks at the cracked housing a long moment, then at the rest of them. Whatever please was about, back at the start. I don't think that was about embarrassment. I don't think it ever was. It wasn't fear of us finding the tech, Orsa says quietly, the first thing she said since the proxy went dark. She's still watching the spot on the table where the small brass face had been, like the absence itself is worth studying. 5 decades in the wild teaches you to tell the difference between a creature protecting territory and a creature protecting a wound. That wasn't territory. He flinched like something had already bitten him once, somewhere we can't see, and he spent every word since making certain we never ask where. Nobody argues with her. Nobody this time particular wants to. Tamsin says nothing at all through any of it, turning the cracked housing over once more in her own hands, tracing the scratched mark's missing tooth with a fingertip, in a gesture she doesn't quite notice herself making. She couldn't say why the mark's particular shade of copper keeps pulling her attention back, again and again, when there are considerably more pressing things in this room to think about. She files the question away, unanswered, the way you'd file away a draft you mean to chase later, and mostly don't. The scatter from there the way tired people scatter when a long job is finally, technically, done. Orsa toward the Wild Root Conclave's way station, muttering something about a land dispute that has apparently not had the courtesy to resolve itself in her absence, already visibly relieved to be putting distance between herself and another night spent under a roof full of brass and steam. Bram toward the Ironbreaker Hall without offering, or being asked, any further he offerance wants to teach which he was going on the or marsh. He pauses only once at the door to look back at the housing still sitting on the work table, the way a soldier checks a perimeter one last time before he's willing to call it secured for the night, and then he's gone too, into whatever the Ironbreaker Hall's evenings actually consist of, for a man who's never once cared to climb its ranks. Orsa pauses at the door long enough to catch Tamsin's eye. No words, just a long, measuring look, the kind a woman gives someone she's already half decided to worry about whether or not that worry's been invited, and Tamsin, for her part, manages something that's meant to pass for a reassuring smile, and mostly succeeds, though not quite well enough to fool someone who spent 50 years learning to read what bodies do instead of what mouths say. Orsa doesn't push. She simply touches Tamsin's shoulder once, briefly, on her way out, and leaves it at that. Wick and Senna, by unspoken mutual agreement, head instead toward the watchhouse holding block, Senna, because she wants, on principle, to see that Quill's been processed properly and not simply forgotten in a cell, the way Aetherglen's overworked watch sometimes forgets the prisoners. Nobody's filed a complaint about yet. Wick, because he has questions of his own he'd rather ask while the trail's still warm, and because, if he's honest with himself, he's a little bit curious what kind of requirement keeps her through. The watchhouse holding block smells like damp stone and old lamp oil, the particular institutional cold that no amount of brazier heat ever quite drives out of old garrison architecture. A bored watch sergeant waves them through with barely a glance at their hall-issued papers. The universal indifference of a man who has seen 1,000 strange visitors come asking after 1,000 strange prisoners and stopped being curious about any of them years ago. Captain Quill, behind iron bars in a cell 3 doors down from the entry desk, looks considerably more at ease with her circumstances than either of her visitors expected. Boots off, coat folded into a passable pillow, the unmistakable posture of a woman who has been arrested often enough to have developed genuine opinions about cell comfort. Well, she says, looking up from where she's sitting cross-legged on the cell's single hard cot, if it isn't my better-mannered captors. Come to gloat, or come to talk business? Bit of both, Wick says, settling against the bars with the easy professional comfort of a man who has had this exact conversation, in this exact posture, with a great many people on the wrong side of a great many bars. Mostly business. I figured you for the business type the moment you didn't kill me. Quill's gaze slides to Senna, lingers there with something that settled over the past day into genuine if rueful respect. You too, dear. Though you, I think, were always going to be business of a different kind. We're trying to understand your supplier, Senna says, direct, because directness has never once failed to be her instinct, even when subtlety might serve better. The one Voss bought from, or sold for, or whoever's above him in that chain. Anything you remember. Straight to business. No gloating at all? I'm almost disappointed. Quill stretches, chains clinking faintly, entirely unbothered by her own circumstances, in a way Senna finds, despite herself, faintly admirable and faintly unsettling in equal measure. Tell me first, the boy with the bad knee, he get clear? He got clear, Wick confirms. Good. Hope it hurts for a week. Professional courtesy doesn't extend to wishing the man well. She says it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather, and it's exactly that lightness, the easy, practiced casualness of someone discussing violence and theft, the way other people discuss market prices, that makes Senna's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Does any of this trouble you? Senna asks, before she can fully decide whether the question is fair. Any of it. The stealing, the smuggling, the men who get hurt on either side of it. Quill considers the question with genuine, unhurried seriousness, which is somehow worse than if she'd simply laughed it off. Troubled me plenty the first few years. You get tired of being troubled eventually, if you want to keep doing the work and keep eating regular meals. Doesn't mean I don't notice anymore. Means I've made my peace with noticing and going on regardless. Different thing entirely from not caring, dear, whatever it might look like from where you're standing. It isn't the answer Senna wants, but it has the uncomfortable virtue of sounding entirely honest, and she finds she has nothing immediately useful to say back to it. Quill considers this with the unhurried calculation of a woman pricing out exactly how much cooperation costs her and exactly how little it's worth fighting over, now that the fight's already lost. Voss wasn't my first contact in that particular trade, she says eventually. Before him, I dealt directly with someone else for a season or two, a go-between, not the source itself, near as I ever worked out. Best manner criminal I've ever done business with. And I want that on the record because it's saying something in this line of work. A short, genuine laugh, more fond than the topic probably warrants. Called me captain, like he meant it as a courtesy and not a job title. Never once raised his voice, never once haggled hard, never once showed me his full face, wore a scarf wrapped clean up over his jaw at every single meeting, rain or clear skies, both. I always assumed vanity, some old scar he didn't fancy being gossiped about in port towns. You'd be amazed how many men in this trade have a face they'd rather keep half hidden. Almost too well spoken, Wick repeats, turning the phrase over with the specific, professional appreciation of a man cataloging a genuinely interesting character for his own private collection of underworld color, nothing more. I like that. I'm stealing that description. Steal away. Cost you nothing, since I'm not using it for business anymore? Quill stretches, unhurried, chains clinking faintly at her wrists. Polite as a hall clerk and twice as careful with his words. Paid on time, every time, which is rarer than you'd think. If I had to guess, and it's only ever been a guess, I'd say he wasn't the top of whatever chain he worked for either. Felt more like a courier with excellent manners than a man making his own decisions. Does he have a name? Senna asks. If he does, he never once gave it to me, and I never once asked twice. Quill shrugs, the gesture of someone who has genuinely stopped caring about a question the moment it stopped mattering to her bottom line. Voss came along eventually, and the well-mannered fellow simply stopped showing up. Business moves on. I assumed somebody got squeezed out, or retired, or finally got tired of the scarf. Didn't think much more about it than that, and I'd wager you shouldn't either. It's a small, strange trade, full of small, strange men who like their privacy. Doesn't make every one of them a mystery worth solving. For someone who didn't think much of it, Senna says, you remember an awful lot of detail. Occupational habit. You remember the polite ones, dear. They're rarer than the rest, and rarity sticks in the memory whether you want it to or not. Quill's smile turns, briefly, almost gentle. Doesn't mean it adds up to anything. Sometimes a strange man with a scarf is just a strange man with a scarf. She studies the two of them a moment longer, head tilted, the same unhurried professional assessment she'd given the whole party back on her own deck. The five of you are an odd little crew, you know. The quiet one with the sickle didn't say 2 words to me. The whole fight, and I still couldn't tell you which of you frightened me more in the moment. Her or the big one calling out my own footwork before I'd finished the step. You've got something working between you that most hired parties never bother building. Don't waste it on a man who hasn't earned your trust yet, whatever he's paying. Is that advice, Wick asks? From a woman currently in irons? Free advice is the only kind worth giving from in here. Can't be blamed for bad outcomes if nobody paid for the opinion. Quill leans back against the cell wall, eyes still open, watching them both with the particular alertness of someone who isn't nearly as relaxed as her posture suggests. For what it's worth, and you can take this for free too, I didn't start in this trade for the coin. Started because the alternative, where I came from, was a marriage I didn't choose and a life I'd already decided I'd rather not live. Piracy's not romantic. It's just the first door that opened when I went looking for any door at all. I'd wager that boy with the scarf had a door of his own. He walked through once too, however polite he is about it now. Most of us did. Neither Wick nor Senna has anything immediately useful to say to that, and after a moment Quill closes her eyes properly, the conversation's natural end announced without another word needed. It's good advice, delivered with more genuine warmth than either Wick or Senna quite expects from a woman they fought across her own rigging 2 nights ago, and they take it more or less at face value. File the well-spoken stranger away in the same drawer as Voss's collector. Color and texture for a strange trade. Nothing yet worth losing sleep over. For what it's worth, Quill adds, as they turn to leave, you really did mean it. About not needing to kill me. A pause, almost private. Don't see much of that where I work. Don't expect I'll forget it. Senna doesn't quite know what to say to that, so she says nothing, and they leave the watch house with rather more to think about than they'd arrived with, even if neither of them could yet say exactly why. She walks the rest of the way to the Ashen Vow alone, Wick peeling off toward his own errand with a wave and no further comment, and the walk gives her more time than she'd like to turn Quill's words over without quite deciding what to do with them. Sometimes a strange man with a scarf is just a strange man with a scarf. It's the kind of sentence that sounds true and reassuring right up until you notice how carefully it avoids actually answering anything. She's beginning to recognize the shape of that particular kind of sentence rather better than she would have a week ago. Tafsteady-doos, Bisnay peels off toward the Ashen Vow, takes himself a but early were. In the aft Ebis-Ader, ye have in the Velvet Ledger's quarter of the city, where a man named Oric has been fencing goods of questionable provenance for longer than most of his customers have been alive. Longer, certainly, than Wick himself has, though it took him a solid 2 years of running odd jobs through this particular backroom before Oric ever bothered learning his actual name instead of just calling him the Quick One Quantwathlete. The sharp. Oric doesn't look up from his ledger when Wick comes in. He never does, on principle, claims it ruins the negotiation to seem eager. But he holds out one weathered hand without preamble, palm up, the universal gesture of a man who already knows exactly why this particular customer has come calling tonight. Let's see it then. Wick produces the coin purse, tips a single coin out into Oric's palm, and watches the old fence's expression do something interesting the moment he turns it to the candlelight. Sky Parrot minting? Oric says after a long, considering pause, turning the coin between 2 fingers like it might tell him something else if he looked at it from the right angle. Brassfeather's house stamp, no less, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm rarely mistaken about a whole stamp, lad. It's half the trade. His eyes come up finally, fixing Wick with the particular, knowing look of a man who has been doing this exact job for 40 years and has stopped being surprised by exactly nothing. You didn't earn this honestly, did you? Define honestly. I'll define it as, this captain's still drawing breath somewhere in a crown cell, last I heard, and Sky Pirate guilds have notoriously long memories about who lightened their captain's pockets while they weren't looking. Oric sets the coin down between them, not quite pushing it back, not quite keeping it either. I'll take it off you. I always take good coin off you, you know that. But I'm marking the price down for the trouble. And I want it understood that if this comes back around to bite either of us, you found this coin on the street and I never laid eyes on it. Generous terms, friendly terms, for a man who could have simply declined the whole transaction and let you find some less accommodating fence to explain yourself to. Aric's mouth twitches, not quite a smile, the particular dry amusement of an old man who's genuinely fond of a habitual nuisance, despite every professional instinct telling him not to be. You're a menace, Wick Talmadge. Charming menace. Still a menace. I prefer enterprising. You would. Oric counts out a stack of coin, considerably lighter than the going rate, and they both know it, and slides it across the table without further comment on the matter. He glances up before returning to his ledger, something almost paternal in the look despite the transaction passing between them. Heard you've gone respectable, by the way. Working a real contract. Hall-sponsored and everything. Don't let it worry you. Wasn't planning to. Oric's eyes glint, amused. Already's moving on to the next entry in his ledger before Wick's even pocketed the coin. Oh, I'll say, I watched you come up through this trade since you were a scrawny thing who couldn't pick a lock without swearing at it for 10 minutes first. Didn't think I'd live to see the day you turned hero. World's full of surprises lately. I'm not a hero, Wick says, more quickly than the comment probably warranted, and Oric's eyebrow climbs a fraction at the speed of the denial. I'm a man getting paid to do a job. Same as always. Course you are, lad. Orge's tone says with great affection that he believes approximately none of it. Same as always. Wick leaves with rather less coin than he'd hoped for, and rather more of an itch under his collar than he'd cared to admit to anyone. Not guilt, precisely. He's quite firm with himself about that on the walk home. But something adjacent to it. Something that tastes uncomfortably like being known a little too well by a man who's watched him grow up exactly as transactional as he ever swore he wouldn't become. It's an old, familiar argument he has with himself every few months. Usually after exactly this kind of conversation, and it usually resolves the same way. A shrug, a change of subject, the comfortable, well-worn groove of deciding that whatever he is, he's at least honest about being it, which has to count for something even if he's never quite worked out what. He decides, by the time he reaches the Velvet Ledger's main hall, that he isn't going to think about it further tonight. He mostly succeeds. The Ashen Vows reporting hall smells of oiled leather and old candle smoke. Ash-gray banners hanging still and heavy along walls lined with the names of paladins, long since passed into whatever the order considers its proper rest. Senna has walked this hall 100 times before tonight, as a postulant, as a newly sworn knight, as someone forever slightly too eager to matter, and it has never once, until tonight, felt quite this strange to walk it as someone returning from genuine work, rather than simply reporting for assignment. Val Captain Marin Ashby receives her in the small side office reserved for exactly this kind of debrief. A woman somewhere past 50, with steel-gray hair cropped close, and the specific, settled calm of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone in this building. A stack of reporting ledgers sits at her elbow, well-worn leather covers soft with handling, and she gestures Senna into the chair opposite without rising, the easy informality of a superior who's earned the right to skip ceremony with knights she actually respects. Sit. Tell me everything, and don't perform it for me. I get enough performance from the postulants downstairs. She listens to Senna's account, the posting, Sterling, the Sky Pirate captain, the fight, with the patient attention of a superior who genuinely wants the details and isn't merely performing interest for ceremony's sake, asking the occasional sharp question that makes clear she's tracking the tactical shape of it as closely as the moral one. When Senna reaches the part about declining to kill Quill, even with a clean shot available, something in the older woman's face softens with real, unhidden pride. That's the vow working in you properly, Ashby says. Not the version that gets taught in the training yard. The version that costs you something to hold on to in the moment it actually matters. She pours 2 cups of something hot and faintly herbal from a kettle that's clearly been steeping far longer than it should. I'm glad to hear it. Genuinely. Thank you, Senna says, and means it, warmth spreading through her chest in a way that has nothing to do with the tea. How's the rest of the hall taking the news? Senna asks, partly out of genuine interest, partly to delay whatever she suspects is coming next. The posting. Me working outside vow business for coin. Mixed, predictably. Ashby's mouth quirks, dry. Half the hall thinks it's good for our reputation, having one of ours doing visible, dangerous work for a respected name. The other half mutters that we shouldn't be lending out paladins like borrowed tools to whoever can afford the fee, regardless of whose name is on the contract. You'll hear both opinions from both wings before the week's out, I expect, and you'd do well to actually listen to the second one even when it's inconvenient. And you? Which half are you? Both, on alternating days, which is the only honest answer anyone past 40 ever gives you about anything. Ashby's mouth quirks again, briefly. Mind you, half the hall's attention this month is already on an evil wing paladin's recent conduct, which is its own headache entirely. Compared to that, a good wing knight doing dangerous, well-paid work for a respected artificer barely registers as hall business at all. Small mercies. Senna's heard the broad shape of the wing tensions before, secondhand in the way every vow initiate eventually does, good, evil, and neutral all sworn to the same oath of the sword discipline, all housed under the same ash-gray banners, and none of them entirely at peace with how the other wings interpret what that oath actually demands of a person. She's never had much reason to think hard about it before tonight. She suspects, listening to Ashby's tone, that she's about to... Ashby's tone shifts. Not unkindly, but with the deliberate care of a superior choosing her next words with real precision. That said, sterling money, That's an unusual purse for an honest cause, Senna, and I'd be failing you if I didn't say so plainly. The man's reputation precedes him in 3 different directions at once. Genius, certainly, nobody disputes the genius. But genius men with that much coin and that much secrecy tend to be funding something they'd rather the rest of us not examine too closely. He's not hiding anything dangerous, Senna says, and hears, even as she says it, how much less certain it sounds aloud than it did in her own head a moment ago. I don't think he is. I think he's hiding something personal, something that frightens him more than it endangers anyone else. Those aren't always different categories of thing in my experience. Ashby studies her for a long moment, not unkindly, the look of a superior deciding how much honesty a subordinate has actually earned tonight. I've known men exactly like him, you understand. Not Sterling specifically. I've never met the man, but the type. Brilliant, charming, frightened of something they've never once said aloud to anyone, including themselves. Sometimes what they're hiding is shame, sometimes it's grief. And sometimes, Senna, it's something they built that they're no longer entirely sure they can control. And the fear you're sensing off him isn't fear for you. It's fear of what you might find if you keep looking. The observation lands harder than Ashby likely intends it to, and Senna sits with it a moment before answering. I'm not telling you to walk away from the work, Ashby continues. The vow doesn't object to good coin spent on good outcomes, whatever its source. I'm telling you to keep your eyes open in a way you weren't quite trained to, specifically around men like this one. Charming men, brilliant men, men who spend their whole lives being forgiven for things smaller men would never get away with. The charm is real. That doesn't mean it's the whole truth. I'll remember that. See that you do. Ashby's expression warms again, settling back into something more familiarly maternal. And Senna, for what it's worth, separate from all of that, I'm proud of the night you're becoming out there. Whatever else this Sterling business turns out to be. Senna leaves the reporting hall considerably more thoughtful than she'd arrived. Ashby's tea still warm in her hands, the older woman's words settling somewhere alongside Bram's quiet observation back at the debrief table. He's never once paused like that before, and a part of her mind she isn't yet ready to examine too closely either. The ash-gray banners watch her go the way they've watched every knight who's ever walked this hall go, indifferent to whatever any one of them happens to be carrying out the door with her. It's well past the hour when reasonable people have gone to sleep by the time Tamsin finally sits down in front of the small, lamplit mirror in her own quarters at the Bloodless Choir, the day's accumulated exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once. The way it always does, the moment there's nothing left to do but stop. The room is quiet in the particular way choir quarters are always quiet. Thick stone, deliberate hush, built by people who understood centuries ago that whatever the bloodline does to a body, it does it more gently in silence than in noise. She doesn't mean to look at the scar. It's simply where her eyes go, the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth without ever quite deciding to, her sleeve pushed back from washing up, the candle throwing soft gold light across her inner forearm. And there it is, the copper-toned line that's marked her skin for as long as she can remember, her own bloodline being a subject nobody in her family particularly wanted to discuss in detail. Her mother used to change the subject, gently but completely, every single time young Thompson had asked where the color came from. Her grandmother, she's been told more than once, used to do the same. It's faded now. The warmth from tonight's single working long since bled out of it, settled back into its ordinary quiet shimmer. She traces it once with a fingertip, an old, unconscious habit, the way some people check a pulse or pick at a healed wound just to confirm it's really there. And then, because some part of her mind has apparently been waiting all evening for exactly this quiet, exactly this lamplight, exactly this stillness, she reaches instead for the small leather satchel she'd carried the cracked housing in earlier tonight, before handing it over to the hall clerk for safekeeping. There's a scrap of oilcloth still inside it, smudged dark along one edge where the scratch mark had pressed against the fabric on the journey home. She holds the smudge up beside her own bared forearm in the same warm candlelight, and looks at both for a long, long moment. The color is the same, not similar. Not close enough to argue about over breakfast tomorrow, not the kind of resemblance you could talk yourself out of with enough determined skepticism. The exact same shade of copper, the exact same faint warmth-suggesting sheen, as if both marks had been struck, or scratched, or groan, or whatever the right word eventually turns out to be, from precisely the same source. Something old and half-remembered stirs at the edge of her thoughts, unwelcome and formless, gone before she can pin down what it even resembles. She doesn't chase it. There is nowhere useful for it to land yet. She doesn't call anyone. She doesn't write it down, doesn't even allow herself to finish the thought all the way to wherever it's clearly heading. She simply sits there a while longer in the candlelight, one copper mark held up against another, and says nothing at all. Not tonight, not to Warsaw, not to anyone. While somewhere outside her window, Aetherglen siphons hum on into the dark, exactly as they have every night of her life, indifferent, as always, to what any one small sorcerer in one small room has just quietly, privately understood.